Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 118 of the Tick Boot Camp podcast. The title of today's interview is I Grew Up with Lyme, an interview with Sophie Eustache. My name is Richard Johannesson.
And I'm Matt Sabatello.
So, Matt, this is another one of these terrible stories where a young child gets sick from Lyme disease and has to go on a lengthy diagnostic journey. But to make things worse, because she's of mixed race, she's half African, they misdiagnosed her with Mediterranean anemia rather than Lyme disease.
What's really sad about Sophie's story is that France is even more behind the United States when it comes to Lyme disease. Once Sophie was diagnosed, she started treating with a protocol called TikToks, but it was shortly discontinued after she started the treatment. She also was not able to take CBD oil because it's not permitted in France. Unfortunately, Sophie's very limited to what she can do to treat her Lyme disease.
So, Matt, I'm really excited to introduce our first French guest to the Tick Boot Camp community, Sophie Eustache.
Hey, Sophie Eustache, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
We're really blessed to have you. So, Sophie, I want to share with our listeners that you are our first guest from France. So can you share with us where you're from?
Oh, that's cool. Well, I'm from the city of Strasbourg, which is at the border with Germany. But I also have to mention that I'm from the French Caribbean originally. So yeah, I'm from France.
So let's talk about that. So you grew up in France. Now, were you born in France, and are you just ethnically from a Caribbean country, or were you born in the Caribbean country and then just grew up in France?
No, my dad is from the French Caribbean, so the island of Martinique, and I grew up in mainland France, in the city of Strasbourg. So it's in the northeast of the country of France, and that's where I spent most of my life, actually. That's where I grew up.
So let's talk about your life in France. What was your educational process like?
Well, I went through the classical school journey in France. So it's pretty similar to what you have in the US, for example, or in, many other countries. And when I was 19, that's when I started university. So I moved to the southeast of France. And I've been traveling quite a bit for my studies. So I decided to focus on the Caribbean. I study social sciences and international relations. And I went to study in Jamaica for a year, for example, last year. And now I'm back in France. So yes, and I will be starting my last year at college in September.
So when you complete your college education, what is it that you plan to do professionally?
To be honest, I'm not quite sure as yet. I had quite specific plans in my head. I really wanted to work in the Caribbean region and focus on international cooperation in the region. So that's, for example, legal accords or trade accords between the countries. But the coronavirus pandemic has made me rethink that, because obviously with all the borders closing up, traveling around the world might not be as easy as it was last year. So I'm still thinking about what I will do next. I still have a few more months to figure it out. So hopefully I will.
So, Sophie, I want to share with our listeners that you are a multi-talented young woman, and you speak as many as 5 different languages fluently and a couple of dialects as well.
Yes, I do. That's one of the perks of growing up in a biracial families, I guess, because you can take in so much culture from both sides. Instead of just having one cultural background, you actually have 2. So I have had German influences from my mother's side of the family and Caribbean influences from my dad. So yeah, that's allowed me to learn how to understand and speak French Creole, for example. And throughout my studies, I've learned different languages, for example, English. And obviously French is my mother tongue. So yes, I really like languages. I think they're a good asset to have.
And I think it's particularly amazing that you've been able to develop so many linguistic skills since you've been suffering from what you now know to be the symptoms of a tick disease since you were a very young child.
Yes, well, Yeah, I mean, I don't really think that the Lyme disease symptoms have affected me that much on this side, at least not when I was younger. And I actually tend to think that it might have helped because, you know, when you have symptoms, physical symptoms, you don't get to be as active, as physically active as other kids maybe. So I used to stay home a lot. I used to read a lot of books. And when I started to get bored with the French books I had, I started to read in English. And yeah, so I was reading a lot. Definitely, I was a bookworm. And I think this has had quite a big influence on my linguistic skills as well. So yeah, I like to think that there is always, you know, something positive coming from every bad experience you have. So obviously I can see some positive aspects from this disease as well.
So Sophie, why don't you share with us when you first started to show the symptoms of what you now know to be your tick disease?
Well, the first symptoms started to show up when I was about 4. So obviously I don't really recall anything, but thankfully my parents were really involved, and since they did not know what was wrong with me, they just kept notes on everything. And yeah, I don't remember, but I was complaining about frequent joint pain, fatigue as well, and yeah, so I was 4 years old.
And when did you ultimately receive your Lyme disease diagnosis?
It took several years. It took about 6 years, because if I remember correctly, I was 10 years old when I was finally diagnosed with Lyme disease. So it was a long process, like so many other people. I was at the doctor's office quite a lot, at the hospital, trying to figure out what was going on, you know, and you get misdiagnosed so easily with so many different diseases and symptoms that you don't actually have. So it took about 6 years to get a Lyme diagnosis.
So let's talk about that window of time in your life between when you were 4 years old and when you were ultimately diagnosed at 10 years old. What do you remember about that period of time? And do you remember specifically seeing a lot of different doctors?
I do. Actually, I do remember that quite well, because, you know, when you, the moment of the week you're supposed to go and play sports, I was usually in the car with my parents, taking me to the hospital for different doctor's appointments. And I don't remember it being too traumatic as an experience, because it was not, I like to think that it was not that bad, you know, you're not sick to the point you can't do anything. And I just knew that something was going on, and I had pain. And my parents explained to me quite well that the doctors were supposed to help. And obviously when you see 5 doctors and none of them can figure out what's wrong with you, then you see 5 others, you start to wonder what's going on. You know, you start to think, well, maybe something's wrong with me and no one can figure it out. I remember it being long and quite painful as a process, but not too, you know, I don't remember it traumatizing me particularly, but I remember spending a lot of time, in hospitals, waiting rooms, especially, yeah. And I also remember, you know, from a child's point of view, you have doctors asking you all those questions that you don't really know why they're asking them, and yeah, I remember it being quite awkward, that's for sure.
Now, do you remember your parents' reaction to doctors failing to diagnose you? And do you get the sense now or then that they were getting frustrated with the failures of the medical community?
Yes, I think they definitely were. I was really lucky to have very patient parents who never doubted what I said, because, you know, when you come to the doctors with symptoms no one can explain, they do have a tendency to just, you know, decide that something's wrong with you, and maybe it's not your muscles, maybe it's not an actual condition, maybe you're just making things up. And thankfully, my parents never thought that I lied, and they always fought for it to get better, for us to find a solution. But yeah, I think they definitely got frustrated with the misdiagnosis, the sometimes borderline diagnosis as well. And yeah, but for sure, I remember them standing up for me every single time. For example, in school as well, because actually when I looked up into the notes that my mom had taken a few weeks ago, throughout this whole process, I found some notes that she wrote to my teachers as well. Because, you know, you're a child, and the main symptom I had, and I still have, is joint pain, and especially in my knees. So your kid shows up in class, and, you know, I complained about joint pain. I complained that I couldn't run as well as the other kids. And, you know, some teachers they just didn't want to hear it. So I had some problems at school with this. And my parents didn't take it. They just, you know, sent them notes saying, whatever my child is telling you, please believe her, because what's the point of a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old making things up about, you know, their health? So yeah, I think it was quite a long and hard process for them as well, because you want to know what's going on with your child, of course. So yeah.
So Sophie, let's talk about what your educational experience was like in that window of time between your 4th and 10th birthdays. Do you recall teachers treating you differently than the other students that you went to school with?
Yeah, I do have some memories of this being a problem. You know, I had one teacher especially, which caused some confrontation with my parents at the time, who just didn't want to believe that anything was wrong with me because, well, you know, the thing with Lyme disease is most of the time you can't see anything wrong with the person in front of you telling you that they're sick. So it's quite hard, I guess, to believe that, you know, something is actually happening. And yeah, I remember one teacher in particular being quite harsh about it and trying to make me, you know, do the physical activities that I just could not do because it was too much. And at some period over those years, I had crutches to walk because it was just too much. And, you know, it was not too much of a problem for me because you're around other kids, you just tell them that your knees hurt and they don't really ask any other questions. But yeah, it was an annoying process going to school every day with these and teachers asking me why I don't just walk, you know, you don't have a broken leg, what's wrong with you? And is this for attention? Is this, you know, to make other people talk about you? And I just didn't understand why they were so, you know, they were on my back all the time, because what was the point of making things up when really the only thing you want to do at this age is be like every other kid. So yeah, that was annoying, yeah, for sure.
Now, did your symptoms interfere with your relationships with other students? Did you have friends, or were you having a different experience socially than your peers in your classes?
No, I don't remember it impacting my social relations at all, to be honest. I remember having, you know, my group of friends, as most kids do, and they stuck with me. They didn't really try and understand what was going on. You know, it was just like, well, so if you can't run at the moment, so we'll just do other things with her. And I remember it being just fine. It was okay. I didn't really mind missing out some activities, to be honest. I think it didn't make me lazy, but it definitely did not make me the most loving, the child that loved the sports the most at the time. It changed since, because I realized it was actually really good and that I actually really enjoyed it. But at the time, I don't think I minded that much. And yeah, it didn't really impact my relationship with other kids my age.
So, Sophie, what sports did you want to play at that time in your life, and how did your Lyme disease prevent you from enjoying the sports that you wanted to participate in?
Well, I remember being obsessed with ice skating, which doesn't really make sense because no one in my family or my friends did ice skating. But I remember I really wanted to do it, and I just couldn't. It was obviously possibly the worst sport that I could have come up with. So that frustrated me a bit. And I do also remember my parents sending me to the swimming pool every week. And actually, I can't tell you if I ever stopped going because of Lyme disease, but I don't think so, because I remember hating it a lot. And yeah, as I said, it didn't really bother me that I couldn't do that much sports. It was probably more the social aspect of it, you know. For example, at school, when you have a break and every kid starts to run around and play sports, well, you can't really participate that much. So I guess this was the hardest part, I guess. But apart from that, I have to admit, I don't really remember it being too hard on me.
So, Sophie, your parents had blessed you with not only a great deal of support and a dogged approach to making sure that they got you a diagnosis, but they also blessed you with taking notes on everything that was happening, which has now given you some insight into what was going on at that period of time. Now, do you recall either from conversations you had with your parents or from reading the notes about whether or not your parents ever found a tick biting you, or whether or not you ever had a Lyme rash?
Well, from the notes about my symptoms started, I remember it started in March, I think it was 2001. And there is one, at one point my mom does write that I had a rash on my body, but no one ever thought there was a tick rash, because obviously that's not really the first thing you would think of, since they did not find the tick. That's for sure, they never saw it. But yeah, so maybe that's also the reason it took so long, because, well, we had nothing to start with. So yeah.
So it's your belief that your mother observed a rash on you and she was sharing that information with your doctors, but none of the doctors used that as a basis to properly diagnose you, at least none of the doctors that you saw until you were 10.
Yes, well, then again, I have to say I'm not even sure my mom mentioned it, because I talked about it with her, and she said, well, you know, you were a 4-year-old child, and I had allergies as well, so it was quite random, you know, to have a rash. It could have been pretty much anything. And yeah, so maybe it was not mentioned, but also the moment my parents started to take me to doctors, to specialists anyways, about my symptoms, it started a bit later, you know, almost a year passed before they actually realized that it was a recurring problem and that I was always complaining about the same things. And once you've been to, you know, your regular doctor and you don't have any solutions, that's when you start getting worried. So yes, I don't think the rash was really a major element in the diagnosis for me.
So Sophie, let's talk about ticks and Lyme disease in France. What did you know about ticks and Lyme disease prior to you being diagnosed? And did you receive any educational information about ticks and Lyme disease during your studies?
Well, no, not at all. That's for sure. I had no knowledge on Lyme before I was diagnosed. And I remember at the time I was diagnosed, I was about 10. So that's a bit over 10 years ago. And well, when we came home from the doctors, we obviously tried to get as much knowledge on the subject as we could. Well, I was quite young, but at least my parents did. And it was a struggle, and to this day it still is, because there is not that much information, even though France has cases of Lyme disease. So yeah, and it was particularly weird because, well, I realized that later, obviously, but the region I grew up in, so Alsace, is the region in France which is the most impacted by Lyme disease. So, you know, the fact that there is no vocal awareness about the disease is quite problematic, I think, because obviously when you come home from the forest or walk around in nature, well, most people do know that you have to check around if you have any ticks on your body, but apart from that, you know, the consequences of a tick bite are not really talked about, that's for sure.
So Sophie, we get the sense from our past podcast episodes that Germany seems to be taking a progressive approach to dealing with Lyme disease. And you've now grown up on the border of France and Germany. Did any of the progressive approach to ticks and Lyme disease from Germany ever bleed its way into the communities where you grew up?
Well, first, the doctor that diagnosed me has been really, really influenced by what is going on in research in Germany. And maybe that's where I got lucky, because obviously in some other parts of France, you don't really have this incoming influence as much. And I'm not sure about the approach. I'm not sure it is really developing the same way in France yet, but hopefully it will at some point be taken more seriously, because I really don't think it is considered a real and an important health issue in France. And yeah, I mean, yes and no. I would say that there is some influence, but I would definitely say that it's not enough yet.
So Sophie, let's talk about your misdiagnoses. What were you misdiagnosed with, either based on your recollection or the notes that your mom and dad had been taking during this diagnostic journey that you were on?
Well, I remember being diagnosed with lactose intolerance, because this has traumatized me, because I could not eat dairy and I really liked it. So this was quite random, but it's pretty much the only diagnosis that I remember. From the notes that my parents took, I read that I was misdiagnosed with hypermobility, and that for quite a lot of time my symptoms were read as resulting of growth spurts. So yeah, the doctors pretty much just concluded that since I was a child, I was growing too fast, and that this was what caused the pain, which obviously did not explain the fatigue. So yeah, and I was also diagnosed with mental illness. Well, I'm not sure diagnosed is the correct term to use, because it was just, we can't find what is wrong with you. So let's just say that you're making it up. So something must be wrong with you. And also one thing that my mom wrote about is that I was misdiagnosed with okay, I'm just going through my notes because I want to use the correct term. Well, as I said, I'm mixed race. So my dad being a black man from the Caribbean, and me being, well, I'm very light-skinned, but I'm still mixed race. So the doctors read pretty much anything they want when you go and see them. So I was misdiagnosed with what is called Mediterranean anemia, which is it's basically a blood condition which sometimes has effects on bones and nerves, and it is especially common with people of African descent. So yeah, I guess it was when you can't figure out what's wrong with you, you go and see a doctor and you tell them, well, I've been to 10 before coming to see you, and this is basically some of the most striking things I was misdiagnosed with.
So now, Sophie, do you believe that either your age, your gender, or your culture played a role in doctors failing to properly diagnose you because of a bias that they were harboring during the time that they were treating you?
Well, I think my age definitely did, yes, because it's quite easy to just assume a child is lying. And yeah, I guess some of them just thought, well, you know what, she doesn't want to play basketball, so she's just saying that her knees hurt, so she doesn't have to. And I think this was, of course, it's much more complicated than that, but I think that, yes, this was probably the reason why some of them believed that it was not legit. And some actually did ask my parents, how can you be so sure that the symptoms she's talking about are not entirely made up? Either from being very young, about 4 or 5 years old. Some kids just, have their own imaginary world. So why wouldn't she make those symptoms up? And then being a bit older, it was, probably read as being convenient. And so I would say my age definitely played a role in the misdiagnosis. And my gender, I'm not so sure. I don't think so. And my race maybe as well. As I mentioned, the condition I was misdiagnosed with, but that was the the only case I read through my mom's notes. And to be quite honest, I was quite frustrated about the fact that, I was not believed. Because, well, it's frustrating. So, yes. And discovering the podcast and getting educated on Lyme disease, reading some experience other people had. Frustration definitely is something that comes back and that a lot of people have to deal with, because even when you're an adult, I've read so many cases of people saying, well, I went to see my doctor and nobody believed me, even though, I'm a however old person. And I think that's crazy.
So Sophie, on one hand, you were misdiagnosed as having a mental illness and anxiety, where basically they were saying that you were faking your pain. And then on the other hand, you were misdiagnosed with the Mediterranean anemia because of your culture and your race. So did any doctors prescribe you anything or give you any sort of medication to treat these misdiagnoses before your ultimate Lyme disease diagnosis?
Well, no, not concerning these two diagnoses anyways, because to be honest, my parents just didn't believe it. They knew that that was not what was wrong with me, because, well, the anemia, first of all, it did not make sense, because when we went through all the tests, well, we could just figure out that it was not what was wrong. And for the anxiety, no, I think at some point my parents did from themselves give me some essential oils or something like this. But I was never treated professionally for it, because they just knew that this was not it. And thankfully they kept looking, because I don't think it would have helped.
Sophie, do you recall, or have your parents ever described to you what types of essential oils they used for you and how they were used to treat you?
Well, concerning the pain, because to this day I still have quite frequent joint pain, and when I have some periods that are more intense than others, I use what my parents used on me when I was much younger, which is wintergreen oil. So I used it as a massage oil, and I used to ingest them as well. I don't anymore, but when I was first diagnosed, the treatment I took, it was pills and drops to drink, which were based on essential oils as well. But to be quite honest, I can't tell you the details of what was in it, but yes.
So before we get to your treatment with essential oils, how long were you misdiagnosed for before you got your Lyme disease diagnosis?
Well, it took about 5 years, 5 or 6 years, yeah. About 6 years, because I was about 10 when I got diagnosed.
So do you think that if you were older or were from a different background and culture, that potentially you would have had a quicker diagnosis?
I don't know. To be quite honest, I really don't know. Maybe being older would have been more complicated for me, because, at some point I think the misdiagnosis, they make you doubt about what you're experiencing. It can definitely happen. So you would be experiencing all your symptoms and having doctors telling you, well, what you're feeling, what you're experiencing is either not legit or not real. I think at some point you can just, think, well, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm making it up. Maybe it's all in my head. And that's obviously not the way to go, because then you never get the proper diagnosis and you can never get better. And yes, that's my thought on.
Sophie, do you think that, so it sounds like you're saying if you were older, then you would have been more directly involved with your doctor's visits, and that you would have doubted yourself that you were really sick, but because you were younger, your parents played a more active role and they never doubted your illness. Is that what your thought process is on this?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, yes.
So walk us through now. Here we are 7 years later after you first started getting sick when you were 4 years old. So you're about 10 or 11 at this point. How did you finally land on Lyme disease?
Well, my parents took me to an osteopath who actually was specialized in Lyme disease, and that's not why we went to see him initially. It's just because, you know, when you're looking for something, when you're looking for answers, you would just go and try anything at some point. I remember my parents taking me to doctors which would make me do weird things. You know, I had this treatment which involved magnets. And I mean, I'm saying weird things from my child's point of view. Obviously, you're not familiar with alternative medicine, and none of it really helped. So, you know, at some point you just think, well, we'll just go and see someone else, and at some point maybe it will work. So that's how we landed at my doctor's, and that's how I got diagnosed. It was from a blood test, and well, when he asked me about my symptoms, everything really matched with Lyme disease. So it just sort of suddenly made sense, and yeah.
So
and also, beforehand, when I went to see classical, if I may say so, doctors and to the hospital, I took blood tests, but the percentage of infection of Lyme disease that I was sick with just didn't match the norms in France, which, as you mentioned, Germany earlier. And it's all about, you know, what is accepted in the medicine institution in different countries. And Lyme, officially, I'm still not affected by Lyme disease today. So you had to take other tests that doctors we went to see before did not diagnose me with and did not think worth trying. So yes.
So you were bouncing around from specialist to specialist, doctor to doctor, including natural doctors that use things like biomagnetism and natural testing, until you finally landed at a Lyme doctor, because you were just going to all these different doctors to try to find what was causing your problem. And when you landed at this Lyme specialist, they then ran your blood out of the country, it sounds like, in Germany. Was that at Armin Labs? You know, is that the lab they used?
I'm sorry?
Do you know the lab they used to test your blood? Was it Armin Labs in Germany that they used to test your blood?
I can't tell you. I really don't know. I don't know.
Okay. But so you mentioned earlier that they were running blood work at the local hospitals, but they weren't looking for the type of Lyme disease that you had. So is the blood test that was done by the Lyme specialist different than those traditional tests done in Germany? I'm sorry, done in France?
Yeah, it was. And at the time, I just didn't understand anything about it. And as I grew older, I got more familiar with all this world of misdiagnosis and different norms and the recognition of Lyme disease in different countries as well. And my brother, I have an older brother who's 7 years older than me. He went and started to work in a lab. He went to work in a lab in which they actually run tests for Lyme disease, and he actually helped me so much to understand why, you know, I had spent all those 6 years being misdiagnosed and getting my blood taken and trying treatments that didn't work, to actually land on a diagnosis that some people get from one visit in the hospital. Because you can get diagnosed with Lyme disease much easily in France. It doesn't mean that you get treated the proper way, obviously, but yeah, I just couldn't understand why it had taken so long. And so the doctor that diagnosed me and that treated me and still treats me to this day had a different point of view. I think this is what changed everything for me. It was the fact that he had been abroad to conferences, he had been abroad to get educated, to do his research, and he had a different way of seeing Lyme disease, of treating it, and this changed everything.
Sophie, from either your parents' perspective or yours, if you remember, what was it like now? You already were tested for Lyme at the hospitals and it came back negative. Now you're at the Lyme specialist and he's telling you you have Lyme disease. So do you recall, or have your parents shared with you what that was like? Did you fully believe it? Were you excited that you finally had a diagnosis? And what was that like for you and your family?
Well, I remember that until the treatment started and started being efficient, I think he was just another quack. You know, I had seen so many. I just thought, well, I'm going to take his pills, and I've tried others before, and it's just going to be the same. So, you know, it can't really be worse. So I remember thinking this for sure, because at some point, you know, it gets tiring. And as I was growing older as well, I wanted to be able to do whatever I wanted to do. I didn't want to stay affected by this. I wanted to have a solution, and whichever it was, of course. And I remember being quite skeptical, and I don't know about my parents. Maybe they were as well, but, you know, thankfully they didn't give up, and we just had to try it. And yes, I remember being quite surprised when it actually had positive effects on my symptoms.
I mean, that makes complete sense. You've been bounced around for 7 years with misdiagnoses and treatments that didn't work. So, of course, you were skeptical to see whether or not this new specialist doctor was actually accurate or not. Now, you mentioned that you were waiting to see if the treatment actually helped you. So can you talk us through what the treatment protocol was that this Lyme litter doctor prescribed for you?
Yes, well, at first he prescribed to me this treatment that actually doesn't exist anymore in France anyways. It's called TikToks, and it was, from what I recall, it was basically a mixture of essential oils and herbs, which were to get it at my symptoms. And I had pills as well, and, you know, I was quite young, and even from my parents' notes, I didn't really make much sense of it. So I remember having to take a lot of pills, a lot of drops, a lot of things that didn't really taste very good. And I was very skeptical about it. And he also prescribed to me vitamins, and somehow it did work. Not entirely, of course, but it did make a difference for sure.
So, Sophie, it sounds like at a high level, because of course you were so young, you don't remember the details, but he was prescribing vitamins and supplements to help strengthen your body, while at the same time he was prescribing you or giving you these essential oils and herbs, both in a pill form and also in a tincture form that you would put like in your mouth under your tongue, potentially, sounds like. And it sounds weird, but it actually started to work for you.
Yeah, it sounds very weird, but it did work. And the way the treatment was shaped made me especially skeptical, because I just thought, well, why would this work? You know, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't look strong. It doesn't look like actual medicine. It looks like something my rabbit could take. And I remember being very skeptical about it, but yes, it did have an effect.
Knowing what you know now and looking back, you think it was effective because it probably was using two different tactics to address the Lyme disease. One being it was killing the bacteria or decreasing the bad stuff in your body. And number two, it was strengthening your body naturally to be able to fight it on its own. And that's kind of what these herbs and essential oils do together. So do you think that's why it had helped you back then?
Yes, I think so. I think, you know, maybe what you were saying about strengthening my body was what had been missing. And obviously when you don't know what the problem is, it's quite hard to target it. So yeah, I think this is why it worked, because it had not been tried before. And as you said, you know, it helped to kill the bacteria which caused the symptoms. And it seems so simple thinking about it now, but obviously when you don't know what the cause is, you can't really treat it. So yeah.
And understandably so, because these types of treatments are not very well accepted, I think, throughout the world. So certainly not here in the United States, and certainly not in France where you are. So I'm sure your parents and you as a young child and your friends and family were skeptical as well. But talk to us about the symptoms that started to get better as a result of this TikToks treatment that you took.
Well, as I think I mentioned earlier, quite a few times before being diagnosed with Lyme, it had started to be really, really bad, and to the point I could not walk anymore. So this is really when I started to be triggered by it. I started thinking, well, maybe what I have actually is bad. So yeah, and I remember it being really, really relieving because I could finally, do everyday kids stuff again. And it was very random, but going through my parents' notes, at some point, my mom just wrote, well, she could run again. And, it doesn't sound life-changing, say it like this, but it actually is when you're a 10 years old child. So yeah, I think this is really when we started to notice that it was actually making a difference. It was actually working.
Especially when you were barely able to walk, and now you're back running and doing things that you wanted to do as a young child, and almost back to being a normal child again. So this was, of course, 12 years ago, and it sounds like you were on this treatment on and off for quite a while, but about 3 years ago, you started to have some worsening symptoms again, especially in regard to your joint pain and your ability to walk. So can you talk to us about 3 years ago and what happened then in your life and what that was like?
Yes. Well, after being diagnosed, I have to say I don't really recall Lyme really affecting my life. I mean, I was taking my treatment. I went to see my doctor every few months, but it was not really something that affected my everyday life. It was just part of my routine, so I didn't mind. And I think it has made me, I consider myself lucky because obviously I think it's easier to live with something you can forget than to be affected by it every minute of every day. And I always had joint pain. It never really stopped, but it was manageable in the sense that I could just take, some painkillers and move on with my day. And this was my routine for quite a few years, for about 10 years, actually. So I could do sports again. I could do everything I wanted to do. And whenever Lyme bothered me, we would just adjust my treatment, or I would take more painkillers, and it was fine. And I never really mentioned it apart from with my doctor or my close family. And I kind of forgot about it. And then a few years ago, as you said, about 3 years ago, I was actually in Martinique at the time, studying there for a year. So I was doing just fine, and I started to notice that the symptoms were stronger than they usually were, and that it was starting to affect my life much more than I wanted it to. So along with the joint pain, I had a big weight loss, which kind of worried me. And I also noticed for the first time some concentration issues, which I had never had before. And I went into denial mode for quite a few months, because I was away from my doctors, obviously, so I could call him, but I couldn't see him. So I thought, well, if I just put this on hold, maybe it will pass. Maybe I'll just, double the vitamin dose and it will get better, which it obviously did not. And this really showed me that, it's not over. You're not done with it. And, you have to actually address the issue. You can't just deny the fact that it's affecting you. And since 2017, it's gotten a bit better, but it's really on and off. I have some periods where it's actually good, and I consider myself lucky, and then some periods in which it's actually an everyday struggle. And for the first time in years, I've had periods when I can just not really get out of bed for like a few days in a row, and I've tried to fight it, but I've actually noticed that it makes it worse. So yeah, we're currently trying to figure out what the most appropriate treatment is at the moment. And it's a bit blurry, but yeah.
Sophie, were you working with the same Lyme litter doctor that diagnosed you from the time you were 10 up until the present date?
Yes.
Sophie, it sounds like since the time when you were 19 and this increase in symptoms occurred to the present date, you tried a lot of things that just didn't work. but have you made any progress at all over the past several years? It sounds like you are doing pretty well today. I mean, you're doing a great job on this interview, and you're doing a great job at articulating your story. So have you made any improvements over the last 3 years?
Yes, well, yeah, I think so. When I came back from Martinique, I studied back in France for a year, in mainland France. And I had this new treatment, which was pretty heavy, and it worked for a time. At least it helped with brain fog for sure. And about last year, in about September or October, well, fall of last year was quite complicated to deal with. At the time, I was living in Jamaica for my studies, and when I left for Jamaica, I actually thought that it was going to be much easier to manage Lyme over there, because for some reason, based on the readings that I had done, on the beliefs that I had came up with, and on my own experience, it's actually more manageable for me when the weather is good, which sounds crazy, but that's what I thought. So I left quite lightheaded, and I thought it was going to be just fine, because I had gotten better with this new treatment, and I had quite an unexpected relapse. So since then, considering I was not in France, and well, Lyme disease is absolutely not developed in Jamaica in the way it can be in other countries, so I didn't have access to the things I needed to have access to. So we couldn't really adjust my treatment, and this was quite a dark period, because I was basically stuck, and it got better since, but it really showed me that you never know, and that I should be really, really more careful. However, I do take in every good period, and I try to enjoy it as much as I can. And I also try to deal with the pain, because I know that the symptoms of Lyme can be much, much heavier than the ones I have. So, you know, I don't know what it's worth, but I do find some comfort in other people's experiences, whether they're better than mine or worse than mine. And I do know that, you know, most of the time my symptoms are manageable. And if I have a period, whether it's a few weeks, whether it's a few months, where it's really bad, I'm lucky enough that it has not lasted for too long for now. And I haven't been really in a really, really bad period for years, since I was really young. So I try to manage, yeah.
So Sophie, give us an idea of where you are at today with your health. If you had to give us an assessment of where you are in the world today, tell us how you feel and where you think you are going with your health in the coming months.
Well, at the moment, I want to say that I'm good, because yeah, I do have some pain, but it's really manageable, and hopefully it will stay this way. Hopefully it won't get worse, and I do have faith in the fact that I can maybe find a treatment that's more adjusted to what symptoms I'm experiencing. So yeah, however, the thing that has me worried a bit is not that much the joint pain, because, well, to be quite honest, you get used to it. It's maybe not the best thing in the world, but you know your body at some point, and you know, well, if I just, you know, take some painkillers, it's going to be fine. I can manage. The thing that I'm most worried about is the brain fog and the concentrating issues. And this I'm not so confident about, because, you know, you never know if it can get worse. You never know if new symptoms are going to appear. So I'm staying alert for sure. But at the moment, I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good.
So Sophie, now we'd like to talk with you about how this Lyme disease journey has actually been positive for you. And you did talk with us a little bit earlier about how it allowed you to be more studious during your childhood. But talk to us about how it has really affected your life in a positive way, and how you've become the person that you are because of your Lyme journey.
Well, as I've said, it's I think it has saved my interests in life a bit. I'm not sure I would have read that many books if I had not been affected by Lyme disease, and if I could have been running around as much as I wanted to. And this has stuck with me. I'm still found in my room reading books quite a lot to this day, and quite to my friend's despair, actually. And yeah, it has really changed, I think, the way I developed as a young, as a teen and then as a young woman, because I see a lot of people talking about their before and after experience, and I can't really say I've had this, because being sick from so early on, you don't really recall what your life was like before, because, well, it's not worth comparing, of course. And yes, I think it has really influenced me, and it has changed what was normal for me. So yeah, and in terms of maybe the social experience that comes with it, this has been quite complicated for me, because I didn't really know what to do with it, because, as I've said, it was a complicated process of being diagnosed, and it was so blurry and so hard for me to understand that I didn't really want to mention it to anyone, because I thought, well, if you say anything, you're just going to be asked questions that you don't want to answer or that you don't know the answer to, and just avoid the subject and it's going to be fine. And a few years ago, especially when I got this relapse, if I can call it this way, a few years ago, I started to really read on the subject. I started to read books, I started to listen to podcasts, to follow accounts on social media concerning Lyme disease, and this has really made me aware of the fact that, my experience is not so different from the experience many other people have, and if they can talk about it, maybe I can, mention it to my friends, and maybe it will make me feel more comfortable with canceling plans or staying home, or going home after a few hours when I'm not feeling good. And this is quite recent for me, and just a few years ago I would never have even thought of being in a podcast such as this one, because it's not something that I talked about. And so yeah, I think it has really influenced a lot of aspects of my life, and some for better, some for worse, that's for sure.
So thank you for that beautiful outline. And now I want to ask you for the last thing we ask everyone by way of assisting our community, and that is, in the event that, God forbid, your dad came into your house tomorrow and showed you that he had a tick biting him on his leg, what would you recommend that he do so that he doesn't have to go through a terrible Lyme disease journey the way you have?
Well, for sure, I would recommend to take it out and to have it analyzed, just to make sure just to know, if it was carrying Lyme disease or not. And but bearing in mind, this process can actually be misleading, because it's so unclear and so blurry, and especially in France, where the problem of Lyme disease is not really targeted officially or in classical medicine. But yeah, I think this is the first thing I would advise anyone to do. And then I'm not so sure, actually. I'm still making up my mind, and I'm still, building up knowledge on the subject. So yeah, I'm not a specialist, that's for sure. I have read a lot about antibiotics treatments, especially early on when Lyme disease is diagnosed. I'm not convinced what I think of it. So I think, considering the natural medicine or alternative medicine has worked for me, that's probably what I would advise anyone to turn to. But I would especially warn anyone worried about Lyme disease about everything that goes around it and everything that it can lead to, because not only my experience, but the experiences of so many other people, and everything I've read, everything I've seen, everything I know just shows how complicated and how complex of a disease it can be. And yeah, I think that's something people should know if anything about this. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Tick Bootcamp interview with our guest, Sophie Eustache. To our listeners, we have a call to action. First, if you'd like to learn more about Sophie Eustache and her French Lyme disease journey, please visit our Instagram page at SOPHISTACHE. Second, if you enjoyed this episode of the Tick Bootcamp podcast, please share it with your friends by using the social media buttons you see at the bottom of the post. Third, Tick Bootcamp is created a Tick by Blueprint that has been inspired by the information that has been shared with us by past podcast guests. We urge you to visit our website at www.tickbootcamp.com to view the blueprint. Please note we would appreciate any input or improvements you would like to offer us. Fourth, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify to get your automatic episode updates to our Tick Bootcamp podcast. And finally, please take a minute to leave us an honest review and rating on iTunes or our website. Thank you for listening.